So we're moving on to concepts of strategy and environmental issues. This is an important area within the SBL exam. Strategy is a very, very common topic, and very often it's combined with some sort of input in terms of the analysis of a given environment. And several of the models we'll see within this particular mind map, for example, Porter's diamond or indeed pastel, are really key in this sort of area. So let's kick off and start with the concept of strategy and indeed what we mean by that. What I have for you is really three key or important definitions, all slightly different, but each of them giving us a slightly different angle on what we mean by strategy for a given business. Let's start with quite a comprehensive one by J, S, and W. Johnson, Scholes, and Whittington. Now, what they talk about is the long-term direction of the company. And this word here, long-term, is key. Because really, when we think about strategies for businesses, we're not talking about next week. We're not talking about next month. And we're really not talking about next quarter. Really, we're talking about the long term. And broadly speaking in strategic circles and broadly in business, long term is really 3 to 5 years. So really what JSW say is that businesses need to devise strategies, not so much for the next period, month or quarter, really for the long term. And that takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of analysis. Let's look at the next definition. And this particular one is really coined in terms of CIMA, the Chartered Institute of Management Accountant, because CIMA's definition is really taken from this. And the key areas within this definition and what the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants have taken for their definition of strategy is really courses of action or the determination of courses of action using resources to carry out goals. So when we think of goals and objectives, I guess goals are quite broad. Objectives are really goals in more sort of defined format. So in essence, what Alfred Chandler is saying is that a business devises strategy in the form of courses of action, things that they're going to do, resources that they're going to use to do those things, whether or not that's manpower, cash, equipment, and indeed everything is hinged on what the underlying or the original goals and objectives are. So really three-part from Alan Chandler. The last one is probably the simplest, Mintzberg. We'll be familiar with Mintzberg because of his strategy formulation theory. Mintzberg talks about the emergent approach to strategy, which is quite simple, and indeed the early part of that sort of strategy formulation technique is really a combination of patterns and plans. So what he's saying is that strategy is really broadly a pattern in a stream of decisions. He's saying in effect that businesses don't spend a lot of time deriving or deciding upon a strategic long-term plan over the next 3 to 5 years. They tend to make decisions based on simple plans and indeed patterns of behavior. Okay? So there's three slightly different definitions. Let's be clear here in terms of the difference between strategy and indeed strategy formulation. A strategy, as we've seen from Chandler's definition, is really a course of action. Strategy formulation is how we decide on strategy. In other words, the approach that we take to coming up with strategy. So the next area for us is sort of considering the characteristics of strategic decisions. And indeed, this area is quite important because strategic decisions really determine the success or otherwise of businesses. In terms of factors, invariably, strategic decisions and strategic decision-making, long-term planning, certainly complex, uncertain because we don't know the future. So many risks involved in making decisions. Should we expand into country X? Should we launch product Y? Etc., etc. So, in essence, an integrated approach is required. What we mean by that is we have to consider all aspects. We can't just consider one aspect, for example, the product or the service. We have to consider the environment. We have to consider our capabilities and competences internally, etc., etc. Another key point really is the issue of change. In other words, strategic planning in the long term is inevitably going to be affected by changes in the environment and by changes in our capabilities, our competences. So companies who are devising strategy, companies that are planning strategically for the long term need to be aware of what's happening outside in particular, but also internally. They need to know what's happening, for example, in a political sense, perhaps in an economic sense, in a social sense, in a technological sense. So there are many, many factors that affect strategic planning and indeed strategy development. In terms of elements of strategic management, a number. Now, I touched up top about the whole area of a strategy versus strategy formulation. And this is with reference to that because this model, this three-part model, was devised by JSW, Johnson, Scholes and Whittington. And what they suggest is that strategy formulation, and it was the idea of being able to approach the formulation of different strategies, has three main parts. And this three-part model really underpins what's known as the rational or formal approach to strategy formulation. So this is just one approach for a business to come up with strategies. So what does it mean? Well, if we look at the cut and paste section snippet that I've taken here, really what we're talking about here is, let's say that we have a business that sets up and decides, okay, now we need to decide on our strategy. Let's use the three-part model by Johnson, Scholes and Whittington, sometimes referred to as ACCA. What does this involve us doing? Well, the first thing that we need to do is to do a strategic analysis. What does that mean? Well, it means that we need to consider the internal and external environments. What we mean by that is we need to wheel out tools and techniques to examine ourselves internally, our resources, our capabilities, our competences, and indeed examine the external environment. What sort of tools would you use for internal and external environmental analysis? Well, on the internal side, most likely a SWOT, Mendelow's matrix, Porter's value chain, a resource audit. On the external side, certainly Porter's models, Porter's five forces, the diamond, as we'll see later on, Pestel, possibly Ansoff's matrix. So this first area for this company, who've just started up and they're looking to do or to come up with some sort of strategic plan for the next 3 to 5 years, involves analyzing themselves internally and analyzing the external environment. So really, in effect, what we're talking about is trying to establish their strategic position. So there's the A in the ACI. Let's establish our position by analyzing the internal section and the external section. What does that give us? Well, what that gives us most likely, having analyzed the environment and analyzed ourselves internally, is a set of strategic choices or options. I mean, surely if we spend quite a lot of time analyzing just about everything that we can analyze, that's going to give us an idea on strategies. In effect, a set of strategic options, perhaps 3 or 4. Now, choice involves identifying the best strategies for an organization and the methods by which those strategies will be pursued. We should know really that any business, if they have, let's say, 4 strategic options, can't really do everything. Resources are limited, time is limited, manpower is limited, cash is limited, etc., etc. So really, this second area, the C, is about deciding, given your strategic analysis and given the fact that you now have 4 strategic options, let's say, which is the best one? And given that, what are the methods that you can use or employ to follow through on that strategy? In essence, what you'd be doing here is most likely, and here's a key tip for the SBL exam, wheeling out a technique such as the SAF technique: suitability, acceptability, and feasibility. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that we wheel out this tool and assess each of the strategic options individually. Okay, strategic option number 1, is it suitable? Number 2, is it acceptable? Number 3, is it feasible? Now, in terms of suitable, we mean, does it have a strategic fit with our mission, vision, and our overall strategic objectives? Is it suitable for us? In terms of acceptable, what we're saying is, given our risk and return requirements, our risk profile, and we're risk averse or we're risk neutral, etc., and indeed the degree to which we feel the return would come on this particular option, option number 1. Given that, do we find this particular strategic option number 1, do we find it acceptable? And importantly, do our key stakeholders, i.e., for example, shareholders, do they find it acceptable? Because if they don't, I think that this option is a good option for us. Maybe it's too risky. Maybe the return isn't quite high enough. So really, in terms of strategic choice, again, my go-to model there would probably be the SAF, okay? Implementation. So we've been through each of the 4 options. We've looked at them. We've turned them upside down and inside out. We've used the SAF technique. We've decided on strategic option number 3. So let's implement it. This is the I in the ACCA model. We need to really come up with a practical plan to indeed implement the strategy. Put this strategy into action. So there you have it. 3-part model. Remember my reference to the rational or formal model. This is, in a sense, just one approach to strategy formulation. There are several others. I've mentioned up top Henry Mintzberg's emergent approach. There are, for example, approaches in line with opportunism, freewheeling opportunism, which is a sort of a head in the sand and no planning at all. Let's just see what happens in terms of strategy. In addition to that, perhaps a logical incrementalism. Okay, that is a step-by-step approach to strategy formulation based on past history or based on what you've done in the past. So the 3-part model's not the only one, but it's certainly one of the best thought of, and indeed one of the most long-winded, because this exercise of analysis, choice, and implementation takes time. It's costly, takes resources. It's not for everyone. Next area for us is just focusing in a little bit more specifically on, analysis. Okay. Now, several things affect analysis. I've said that really it's sort of 2-part, isn't it? We've gone through that. We know what we're going to do. We're going to look at ourselves internally, resources, competences, capabilities, etc. We're going to look externally at all aspects of the internal environment. We're going to use a variety of different tools. Now, certainly analysis, our purpose, or indeed our strategic objectives, our overall objectives, are really very important. They will have been decided upon prior to this analysis taking place. We know what our overall corporate objectives are. So whatever we decide on, whatever we do in this area, excuse me, of the A or an S, we need to keep our strategic purpose in mind. In addition to that, let's not forget that whatever we do, every business has some form of culture. Every business is impacted upon by the culture within the organization and indeed national cultures as well. So let's not forget culture. In terms of just a quick definition of culture, remember that Handy's definition, Charles Handy's definition, is probably the easiest one to remember. What Handy says is culture is the way we do things around here. Now imagine yourself trying to devise strategy, perhaps implement some sort of quite a difficult, comprehensive, a changing strategy over the course of time, and you don't consider culture. You don't consider people. You don't consider how we do things around there. That could end in disaster. Another key area is here, this SWOT analysis. Now, for SWOT analysis, we should know from our sort of past studies that really a SWOT analysis really is broken down, I guess, into two parts. For me, the S and the W really are what's good and bad now, okay? The O and the T, some would say, well, those are sort of, external factors. I agree, but I also think O and the T are certainly what's going to be good and bad in the future, opportunities and threats. So in terms of, an approach to a SWOT analysis, rather than simply saying, oh, well, then let's just list our strengths, list our weaknesses, list our opportunities, list our threats, and then go home. What we need to think of is, what do we do? What do we do in relation to these areas? When we think of a strength, for example, let's try and match a strength to an opportunity in one way. And let's try to minimize our weaknesses, and if at all possible, avoid the threats that are in play. These areas, established reputation, international competition, are just examples of the types of things that you might include under this heading. Okay, let's move on from there. Next area for us is, the area of choices. Now, we saw up top what we mean by choices is, broadly speaking, if the analysis provides us with 4 choices, 4 options, if you will, we need to decide, where do we go? And, how are we going to do this? Which would be best? And remember that invariably we would probably use a technique such as SAF. I draw your attention to chapter 12 on choices in this respect, which gives us much, much more detail. The choice that we make is crucial. As I've said, we can't take on every single option. We have to choose 1, maybe 2, if we have the resources and indeed the capability to do so. Okay? Now, next area is strategic implementation. Now, as I said, that is really putting things into play. This is about action. This is about an action plan, a set of steps that really kicks this particular, let's say, strategic option 3 into action. And note that once we get through each of the 3 stages of analysis, choice, implementation, we're not done then. We need to, in effect, loop round and review and control. The idea that we simply choose strategic option 3, put it into play, and then just sit back with our feet up, that's not going to work. We invariably need to come back to the analysis in due course, in a year, 18 months, 2 years, and really do the exercise again. But in that interim period, we need to keep on top of the strategic actions, or indeed the strategies that we have implemented, that are in play. Okay? Review and control. Okay? Now, in terms of the macro environmental analysis, we've talked about how we might approach the analysis phase, and indeed the importance of the external area. We talked about tools, whether or not it's Porter's 5 forces or Pastel, etc. These tools are key to success, and indeed we need to be able to use them correctly. We're going to touch in the first instance on what you might call, or what the examiner would refer to as, a suitable tool, PESTEL. Now, let's bear in mind that within the SBL exam, more often than not, the examiner does not specifically mention tools in requirements or models in requirements, more often than not. What he'll tend to say, certainly in areas that pertain to strategy and indeed the environment, he'll tend to say something like, use a suitable tool. So key point and key trick here to remember is, where the question pertains to the environment and strategy, there are only really three. There is PESTEL, which we're just about to run through, Porter's Five Forces, and Porter's Diamond. Those are the three. Now, in terms of order of preference, more often than not, I'm more inclined to go with PESTEL and indeed Porter's Five Forces than I am the Diamond, because the Diamond, as we'll see in a moment, just down this mind map, is quite specific. It sort of focuses in on really what you might refer to as the competitive advantage of different nations, whereas PESTEL and indeed Porter's Five Forces are much broader models. PESTEL, as we'll see in a moment, is about assessing a series of factors in a national or global market, as it were, and just coming up with perhaps those that are relevant to us, our business, and indeed our future. Very, very broad. Porter's Five Forces is similar in a way because it considers 5 key forces in a broad market or industry, and really encourages the user to assess the strength of those forces. They may be very, very strong, they may be very, very weak, or they may be in the middle. But at the end of the day, with Porter's Five Forces, the user is encouraged to make a considered opinion, or give a considered opinion on the attractiveness or indeed profitability of a given market or industry. Okay, so certainly PESTEL, Porter's Five Forces first, and then outside of that, in third place, for me, the Diamond. More of the Diamond in a moment. So with PESTEL, what are we talking about? Well, PEST-L, or indeed PEST as it were, both the same, I'll explain why in a moment, is really referred to as an environmental scanning tool. Going back to the 3-part model, ACCA, PESTEL would be part of an environmental analysis. So, if you're wheeling out PESTEL, what sort of questions would you consider? You know, I guess what you'd be thinking of is, yeah, there's lots and lots of external factors that affect all businesses, but what are the ones that are most important to us? Not all external factors, e.g., politics, or indeed, not all external factors affect all businesses in the same way. So the key point is, what is relevant to us? I think third point is also quite important. It's something that's often missed out by observers, by users, by students, by lecturers, is that PESTEL is, yes, a scanning tool, but the environment changes over time. Just because you undertake a very, very comprehensive PESTEL analysis now or this month, that does not mean that in 3 months' time, your findings as of now this month haven't changed. They could have changed in numerous ways. So the problem with environmental analysis, generally speaking, and indeed the use of a tool such as PESTEL, is you need to be careful as to frequency. Really, you need to be scanning the environment, or businesses need to be scanning the environment on a reasonably regular basis. I'm not saying every month or every quarter, but just recognize that things change, and identifying the drivers of change may help you to anticipate change. So let's look at the real detail then under this banner of PESTEL. Now, I mentioned that PESTEL or PEST is basically the same. You're probably aware of that, but just in case you are not, if we're using PEST, then obviously the L and the E on the end have been chopped off. We would include legal factors under the P, under political factors. Okay. Now, in terms of the other area that would be missing, it would be environmental. That would be including environmental factors under the S. So in a sense, we'd have 4 headings, but all 6 areas would be covered. Watch for that. I think it's always better if we're challenged to produce a full pest analysis or a full pestel analysis. Make sure we don't forget legal factors and indeed environmental factors. They should be included whether or not you're using PEST or PESTLE. Now, how do we use it? How do we use pest? Well, as you'll see here, let's take a look at, let's say, political, just as an example. So we're running a business. We've decided to do an environmental analysis. Clearly, pest or pastel is going to be one of our go-to tools. We're doing some research into the environment as to how these areas may affect us. You know, does taxation policy or possibly changes in taxation, is that likely to affect our business? If so, in what way? Outside of that, you know, are we involved in some way in operating internationally? Will, foreign trade regulations or possibly a change in foreign trade regulations, will it affect us in some way? In addition to that, is there an election looming? You know, perhaps, a socialist party, left wing is in situ. Perhaps we expect a change of government. Is that going to affect us? So really, just taking political as an example, you can see how different areas will affect different companies in different ways. Another quite simple one, obviously, to take into hand is economic factors. You know, what is the situation, let's say, in our home country economically? Are we in recession? Are we growing? You know, is there high unemployment? Is disposable income rising or falling, etc., etc., etc. So in terms of economic factors, again, you can see how some, if not all of these, could affect businesses in different ways. Let's take a look at environmental factors. Now, this is quite important because certainly the environmental factors, I'm talking about things like, emissions. I'm talking about things like being sort of pro-CSR, environmentally friendly, looking at carbon targets, etc., etc. This is an area that has become more and more in play for businesses in a number of different ways, particularly businesses that are involved perhaps in manufacturing. So again, environmental protection laws, are we adhering to them? Are we complying with them? Will they be changing? Is there news of significant changes? You only have to look at many governments and their carbon emission targets, which have come down really in the last 5 to 10 years from 2050, even 2060, down to 2025 and 2030. Things change over time. And if you're not using tools such as Pestle to monitor the environment, you could end up falling foul of the law. Last area I'll say is technological. Now, we know how much tech has impacted upon businesses in terms of disruption over the last 10 to 15 years. And, it's only going to continue. You only have to think of things like AI, VR, ChatGPT, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to know that this area for many, many businesses is absolutely crucial. We need to know, for example, about possible new discoveries or developments. We need to know about obsolescence. Perhaps a technology that we've been relying on for several years is about to become obsolete, etc., etc., etc. So, in summary then, based on this particular tool, Pestle, what we know is, yes, this is quite central to strategy. If we're trying to formulate or devise strategy, or indeed come up with suitable, successful strategies in the long term, we need to consider the environment, because the environment in one way or another has a pretty significant effect on all businesses. Let's move on to our next area, This one, it concerns the sort of drivers. Now, I mentioned up top that you really can't consider the environment without considering drivers of change. Businesses that are up to speed on drivers of change are invariably going to be more successful. So, what sort of things affect change? What sort of things drive change? Well, you're familiar with this word, globalization. Over the course of time, certainly markets in the world have, in effect, been manifestly changed by globalization. The world is getting smaller. That's impacted upon by a number of different things, not least social media, improvements in transport, etc., etc., etc. So globalization has a major effect on all countries' markets, but also on global markets, clearly. The next area for us really is, communication. When we look at communication, the way that people communicate now in business, let's say in comparison to even 10 to 15 years ago, it's become completely different. And indeed, over and above that, distribution channels are changing and have changed. Probably not quite as much as communication, but certainly things are changing. Next key point is cost globalization. It was the idea that the fact that the world has become smaller, cost bases have changed in a number of different ways, and that's impacted upon by sort of operations such as multinationals, transnationals, and indeed global entities. Costs are coming down. Next area is trade policy. Again, trade policy varies from country to country, but trade policy does change. Governments change, and governments have different views. In terms of standardization, we're talking there in one way about standardization in terms of products. Do we wheel out the same product in one country as we do in another country? And indeed, why? Last area for us is, given globalization, given the change in communication channels and indeed in distribution channels, the world markets become more and more competitive. We have countries, in South America competing in the same industries and companies in Asia. The world and the business environment certainly is getting more and more competitive. Next area for us is something that's important when we consider strategy, drift. Now, it sort of does what it says on the tin. It's not really a good word, okay? Strategic drift means moving away from your original strategic plan. Let's take a look at a key definition here that I've cut and pasted out of the ACCA Study Hub. Now, this is quite a mouthful. I'll try and summarize it for you once we've read through it. So what the ACCA Hub says, is a situation where strategy gradually moves away from the forces at work in its environment. So Charles Handy first defined the term a gradual change in strategy, a drift from vision that occurs so subtly that it's not noticed until it's too late. So we're talking about probably factors in the environment that tend to, possibly without a company knowing, shift the company away from their original strategy or their original vision. It goes on to say, it occurs where strategy progressively failed to address the strategic position of an organization and performance deteriorates. In essence, what he is saying and what we're saying here is because of the fact that the environment tends to change, we take our eye off the ball on what we originally had as a vision or indeed a set of corporate objectives, really starts to go in the wrong direction. So in essence, drift or strategic drift is not good. We're off track. We haven't recognized, for example, drivers of change. We haven't recognized that the environment's changed and we're still heading in one direction when we should sort of shift slightly. We've drifted away from where we should be. Now, in terms of phases or the process, we can take some advice from JSW here. The key point is to recognize drift early and take action. If we don't recognize it, we're in trouble, as you'll see from the model that we're just about to look at. So, what do JSW suggest? Well, first things first, as we said up top, invariably, whether or not we're drifting or not, we need to keep an eye on the environment. Let me just go back a bit and show you that model. My apologies. Here we have it. So let's just take a look at the model and I'll come back again. So it's very, very straightforward. In JSW, they're simply saying that, we have environmental change here in blue and we have strategic change here. They're saying really 4 main phases. So we're talking about maybe early phase, the environment tends to change. Maybe we have a fix on it. We're sort of keeping an eye on it. But then, it starts to change even more. We start drifting. We have our strategic change here, and we have environmental change. So you can see the gap getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Then we go into flux. So this is where the madness occurs. We are all over the place, going around in circles. And if we get to this point here, either we've recognized that some sort of transformation in our approach, some sort of adjustment in our strategy is required to get us back on track in terms of where the environment is heading, or we die. Okay, so either transformational change, let's get back on the pitch, or we die. All right, let's get back to the action here. The final point was really that, very often where strategic drift occurs, companies recognize it eventually, but probably too late. We need to avoid that sort of phase 4, as I said up top, where we've become within the flux phase 3, so far removed from what's actually going on in the environment that to get back on track and to make that sort of transformational change, to be back on side, is extremely difficult, if not impossible. So strategic drift is a problem for businesses, absolutely. Now, in terms of the diamond, I've mentioned the diamond a couple of times already in this particular mind map video. Let's remember what I said. Porter's diamond is an environmental tool alongside Pestel and certainly alongside Porter's 5 forces. Where we see a question in the SBL exam that involves in some way strategy and or the environment, then certainly Porter's diamond could be in play. I've certainly seen since September 18, when the SBL exam was introduced, the diamond has been used in a requirement several times. So what do we mean by the diamond? What is Porter talking about? He's certainly been very, very busy in coming up with a series of models, but what's he referring to in terms of the diamond? Well, just in terms of a little bit of background, Porter's thesis was entitled The Competitive Advantage of Nations, okay? And that's where he first mentioned the diamond. Now, in essence, what he said was that different nations have sort of different industries that perform well, and yet other nations have the same industries that really don't perform well. A simple example that I've referenced elsewhere, let's say, is the German car industry. There are many others, the French wine industry, Silicon Valley in the US, etc., etc. So in essence, what we're saying and what Porter suggests is there are reasons why particular industries thrive in particular countries. And those reasons might be called, to use his word, determinants. They're really things that are in play that assist in the development and sustainable development of a given industry. So looking at the German car industry, he's suggesting that if we look back over the last, say, 120 years at the German car industry, what he's suggesting is, yes, the diamond was certainly in play there. And, each of these 4 factors, assisted in some way in the development of the car industry in Germany. You have to think about it. Why is it that Germany has a number of key premium and very, very good car brands. Porsche, Audi, BMW, Volkswagen, etc., etc., etc. And yet, neighboring countries, for example, the Czech Republic or France, Luxembourg, etc., very little in the terms of car manufacture. There has to be reasons. There has to be determinants, or is it just luck? It can't be luck. So, in terms of these areas, what do we mean? Well, I'm going to take you sort of through the areas one by one. Let's deal first and foremost with demand conditions. Now, I'll use the German car industry as the example here. So we're suggesting, and perhaps Porter is wrong, but we're suggesting that looking back at the German car industry over time, it would have sort of started to develop in its sort of fledgling form, I would have thought, in the 1920s, the 1930s. We're really saying that in terms of demand conditions, we're saying that really not so much the volume of demand, not so much the number of consumers, we're talking about the conditions. We're saying that the German car consumer, the German car buyer, was quite sophisticated. In other words, the conditions in play for German car manufacturers were such that the end consumer wanted good quality, wanted innovation, wanted some sophistication. The Germans love their cars, and they did even going back to the 1920s. Do remember that at that time, or certainly towards the 1918, 1919, 1920, Germany had certainly in part been decimated by the First World War, and yet by the 1920s we had individual consumers, car consumers in Germany, with a certain degree of sophistication, wanting good quality cars and being prepared to pay for them. And over the course of time, this just developed further. So over the next 20, 30, 50, 60 years, the German car consumer maintained their need for quality, maintained their need for sophistication and innovation. And what happened was that those areas drove the success of this industry, pardon the pun. So in a sense, the consumers and their intelligence, their savviness in relation to what a good car is, what a reliable car is, what a quality car is, as opposed to the reverse, led or indeed assisted in the development of the industry. So demand conditions, yes, they were in part a determinant. Now remember, I said I'm not just talking about high volumes of demand. I mean, you could have in a given industry a high volume of demand, but consumers who weren't sophisticated. In other words, that's not going to be a situation that drives high quality, that drives a premium product, that drives uniqueness. We need sophisticated consumers, and that's what we had in Germany. We had volume, of course. Without volume, we're in trouble, but we had sophistication. Okay? Now, in terms of factor conditions, what we're talking about there is really, endowments of production. Now, what I mean by that is sort of areas that affect the ability to produce quality. Okay? Now, according to Porter, under the banner of the diamond, factor conditions are, broadly speaking, split into two main parts. He referred firstly to man-made factors or man-made conditions, and secondly to natural or naturally occurring factors. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, let's take naturally occurring first because it's easier. And again, we're using the German car industry as our example. Let's think back to the 1920s and the 1930s and think about naturally occurring factors in Germany that would have assisted in the development of the German car industry. One obvious one is the Ruhr River. If you look at the geography of Germany, the Ruhr River runs through Germany and provides a transport route, i.e. transport by river, by ships, on rivers. So in other words, various parts of the country of Germany are accessible through the use of the Ruhr. Outside of that, if you look at Germany's history in terms of mining, etc., coal and iron ore are readily available, certainly were at that time. So again, natural resources. Outside of that, let's think about things like population. Quite a significant large population. Now, we mentioned that that wasn't the core area under demand, but certainly, there was a high population of consumers. That's a naturally occurring factor. And then on top of that, there are many areas here, but certainly under the banner of naturally occurring factors, given that there was a high population, there was certainly a high degree or availability of unskilled labor, factory workers, etc. So the first part of factor conditions concerns determinants that just happen to be in play on a natural basis. They were naturally occurring. The next area is man-made factors. Now, we think of man-made factors, we're talking about things like, for example, the business infrastructure, the transport infrastructure. I touched on the idea of the Ruhr River being used for transport, but I'm talking about things like the road network, the rail network, to be able to transport parts, iron ore, coal, etc., etc. So those areas, a transport system, that's not naturally occurring, that's man-made. Business infrastructure, that's man-made. Things like IT or advancements of IT, again, man-made. So, in terms of the development of the industry in Germany, going back to the 1920s and 1930s, what Porter would suggest is, there were some man-made factors that also assisted. Now remember, we don't need to be an expert on any particular industry or the reasons why it developed. We just need to be able to understand what factor conditions entail and possibly be able to pick them out from a scenario and put them under the banner of factor conditions. Let's deal with the third one here, related and supporting industries. Now, what do we mean by that? This is quite an interesting one because, let's think back to the history of Germany. I mentioned the First World War. Now, the First World War, as we know, didn't end well for Germany, but at the end of the day, after the First World War, there were certainly a high degree of skill bases left in Germany. So typically, if we think about the Luftwaffe, in other words, the German Air Force in World War I, they, certainly in the early part of the war, they were in the ascendancy. They were much, much better than the British Air Force. So if you think about the similarities between an early First World War German plane as part of the Luftwaffe and indeed, let's say, an early car, there are some similarities. So really, the skill set or the skill base involved in producing a good quality First World War plane, not dissimilar to the skill set involved in producing a car. I'm thinking about things like an engine, a cockpit, tires, etc., etc. So really, what we're saying in terms of related and supporting industries is that after the First World War, there were still, even though Germany was in part decimated by the First World War, over the course of time, that skill base did exist. And indeed, there were clusters of supporting industries that in one way or another were relevant to the German car industry, tire producers, expert engineers, etc., etc. Last area here is strategy, structure, and rivalry. And here, really, it's three-part. This is probably one of the more tricky ones to explain and for students to sort of think about in one sense. But in terms of strategy, broadly speaking, we can look at this a number of different ways, but I think the simplest way to look at it is to say, let's take the German car industry and think about strategy. What we're saying is that fledgling early car manufacturers in Germany had similar strategies, and their strategy really was to recognize that German car consumers liked quality and would highly likely be interested in premium, reliable, fast cars. Okay, so their strategy, in a sense, was to give them what they wanted, not to give them what they didn't want. So many of the early car manufacturers were on the same page, and their strategy was to not just understand customer needs, but to deliver customer needs, and that proved a success. They got it right. In terms of structure, if we think back to the German car industry, I'm no expert on it. In terms of structure, what I'm talking about is organizational structure there, and indeed the structure in which business is done. In the 1920s and 1930s, many of the early car manufacturers in Germany realized that really a flat structure, in other words, ground shop floor type structure was the best way forward, rather than any sort of bureaucratic, a series of levels within the business. So in essence, the structure of many organizations linked to and indeed within the German car industry was quite flat. So we had everyone working together on the same floor. Imagine a sort of an open style hangar where cars are being produced, directors are about, engineers are about, drivers are about, testers, etc., etc. So again, structure, they got it right. Now, in terms of the third area here, rivalry, as I've said and indeed mentioned, we could name maybe 4 or 5 at least premium car brands right now, right today. Now, they all weren't in existence going back 120 years or 100 years or thereabouts. But certainly there was, within Germany, over the course of time, from the 1920s, 1930s onwards, despite 2 world wars, a high degree of rivalry between businesses. You had Porsche competing with BMW. You had BMW competing with Mercedes. You had Mercedes competing with Volkswagen. This rivalry drove success. It drove this industry in this country. And indeed, could we compare Germany now? Is there another country really that produces such a wide range of cars? Well, perhaps Italy, perhaps the US, but really for me, having driven some cars, from nice cars, German cars from time to time, for me the Germans have it right. And indeed that stems from the 1920s and 1930s. German cars, for me, are the best cars, absolutely. So there is a sort of, if you will, an analysis of the diamond. Let's bring it back to the exam. Now, as I've mentioned a few times, we're never going to be asked to wheel out Porter's diamond. We're going to be asked for a suitable model. So in scenarios, and do look for hints in the pre-scene as well, what we're looking for perhaps is reference to, these types of factors where we see the examiner talking about the industry being successful, talking about maybe the consumers, saying that there are clusters of different and supporting industries, etc., etc., etc. Really, that's what we're looking for. And if we get a sniff of that, then certainly we'd be looking to wheel out the diamond. Absolutely. Now, a little bit more in terms of detail on this whole area of competitive advantage. Note that what Porter says within his thesis, the competitive advantage of nations, is that these 4 areas are the main areas. These are the important areas. But what he also says was, outside of the diamond, outside of the 4 areas, I haven't really considered, but it may be important, government intervention, or lack of it, and also just chance events. In other words, things that just come into play by chance, that just happen to assist the industry. So let's take a look at governments and a little bit more detail there, because as you would expect, governments can have an impact in a positive way or possibly even in a negative way on the development of given industries. So let's see how. First things first, it may well be that certain governments offer or provide some sort of specialized investment. In other words, if a company is working in a particular field, let's say, or investing in a particular way, there may be a break available to that company or indeed within that industry. Outside of that, certainly privatization and deregulation is relevant. Where governments are privatizing industries, whether or not that's transport or anything else, that can have an impact certainly on the development of industry quite quickly. Deregulation is also relevant. The more regulation, the more red tape that exists within the industry, the more difficult it is for it to grow. I mean, regulation is needed, but it certainly doesn't assist in terms of extreme fast growth. Outside of that, clearly, funds, whether it's grants or subsidies or possibly even tax breaks or incentives, they can encourage firms within an industry and indeed help it to grow. Final one here, economic zones. Many countries, China, the UK, America, they set up these special economic zones to drive industries and indeed, in particular, to drive areas forward. So certainly governments can have an impact. They can, to some extent, make or break. Weaknesses of the diamond. You'll see here CAON, competitive advantage of nations. So that was Porter's original thesis where he introduced to us the diamond, Porter's diamond. Now, are there some weaknesses? Absolutely. This thesis, going back, I believe, to the 1980s, only focused on developed nations. Now, I think, yes, that's a weakness because, there are other nations in stages of development, and certainly there are developing nations, sometimes in the past referred to as third world. But I guess the bottom line is that if we're looking at established industries and successful industries, there are very few nations that are sort of only partly developed or developing that will have extremely successful industries. So whilst that is a criticism, I think Porter founded his logic on good ground. Outside of that, as just mentioned up top, governments can do a lot of positive things, tax incentives, grants, zones, etc. But, they can also mess things up, and that can change over time. It may well be that a government supports an industry for a period of time, but they can also take that support away. So the diamond isn't bulletproof, that's for sure. Next area for us is scenarios, or indeed, scenario planning. Okay. Now, again, I would watch for this in terms of possible SBL topic areas because we've seen this examined at least once, if not twice. What do we mean, and broadly, what's the purpose of this idea of scenarios, or indeed scenario planning? Firstly, what is a scenario? It's a sort of a view, a view of the future. We're really talking about looking at what might happen down the line, versions, if you will, of the future. Now, on that basis, are they useful to us? Well, I think they are, in the form of scenario planning. So where we have situations or futures that are uncertain, where we're concerned about risk, where we find it very, very difficult to see how things are going to move for us, for our business, for our strategic planning, in the medium to long term, then what we could do is come up with set scenarios. And there are different views of our future. Well, here's scenario 1. Here's scenario 2. Here's scenario 3. So, what does that do for us? Well, what that does for us is it allows us to establish what would our action plan be under the banner of scenario 2. If scenario 2 was in play, what would we then do? So again, you're talking about, in one sense, gaming, or the idea of a game where you're trying to look at possible views or outcomes in the future, and you're trying to establish as a business, okay, if that was the case, what would we do? And if it does come into play in some way, shape, or form, hopefully, as a result of this scenario planning exercise, you are maybe not entirely ready, but certainly more ready. Okay. Next area for us here is just this TCFD framework. Now, this is just a slight tangent in one sense. Let me explain. Let me explain what I mean. Sorry. We're talking about task force on climate-related financial disclosure. Okay, so this is a body really who suggest that scenario planning is good in this area. Okay, this is a task force that are concerned with climate change, etc., and indeed the impact that businesses are having on our climate. Now, in terms of the why, well, we're really suggesting here, or at least they're suggesting, that companies need to build in strategies that address this area. We can't just have a head in the sand approach. I mean, obviously, businesses in the main exist for profit reasons, to search for profit, to generate profits, but we cannot ignore, and this particular body or task force doesn't want us to ignore the impact of businesses on the climate and indeed the whole area of climate change. So I guess what we're doing here is we're sort of just taking this task force view because they put forward several suggestions in relation to how scenario planning can tie in with that. And indeed, I guess in one sense, they sort of suggest, well, here's some good or best practice in relation to scenario planning. So this is why I think the ACCA have included this, because this list of points is very, very good. If you will, it's a sort of a set of steps, as it were, as to how to plan or to use scenario planning in the best way. First things first is to ensure that governance is in play. Okay? Integrate scenario analysis into your strategic planning or into the management process. Make it a set, cemented part of what you do, okay? Not just a one-off exercise. Outside of that, number 2, consider, before you do anything, the risks. Consider the risks in each of these different areas. You'll see that this is not dissimilar to sort of scanning the environment using, say, PEST or indeed PESTEL. Number 3, here's where we decide on, let's say, a range of scenarios. So given the above, i.e., given our assessment of risks, etc., and indeed the environment, let's come up with possible scenarios. Number 4, let's evaluate the business impacts of these scenarios. In other words, the effect of the said scenarios in number 3 on us strategically, on us financially, and, identify key sensitivities, identify where we should have serious concern. If scenario number 2 comes up, this could happen in this area of our business. For example, cash flow or staffing or regulation, etc., etc. Number 5, identify possible responses. In other words, given that we've assessed the impact of several scenarios on our business, and some of them are a little bit worrying, how do we respond? What decisions do we make in relation to these sensitivities, in relation to the impact or effects of these different scenarios on our business? Outside of that, number 6, document and disclose. So really, put your findings based on 1 to 6 and particularly 2 to 5 in writing. Document the process and really communicate it with relevant parties. That could be key stakeholders, it could be the board, shareholders, management, etc., etc., etc. So in essence, this task force, obviously climate change is important, all businesses should be aware of it, but really what they're doing, and I think the reason that the ACCA have included this area, is there's a blueprint, there's a set of action steps as to how to use scenario planning for any business in any situation. Okay? So, really, this concludes Chapter 9. I hope that you found that helpful. Some quite useful information in there, not least in terms of the key models. Okay? Remember that models in play within an SBL exam give us structure, don't they? So, if we're asked to wheel out a suitable model, if we think, oh, we could use Pastel, or we could use Porter's Diamond, or we could use Porter's Five Forces, it gives you a structure to the answer. I always think that if you have a structure, rather than having to write from blank, it makes things a lot easier. I mean, put simply, I'm talking about, well, if I choose Pastel, let's just say that I open up with some sort of intro to the report. I have my 6 headings. I scan the unseen, i.e. the question paper, for anything that's relevant within the exhibits to each of the headings, and then I conclude. I know that's very simple, but you get what I mean. Models provide structure for answers. I think that makes the answers easy to write. Okay, so do think about strategy as mentioned. Perhaps do a little bit of research online in relation to some of the areas that I've mentioned, and do understand how sort of strategy certainly combines with that 3-part model. We have to really, in some way, shape or form, be looking at the environment on a reasonably regular basis to make sure that we're on track, and indeed that we avoid the old area of drift. Without a fix on the environment, it's easier to drift. Okay, many thanks for listening.